Does the dynasty roll on, or is it rolling to a stop? MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, previewing teams across the country, getting us set for 2019. We are just, look at that, 18 days and change away from the opener in Orlando. Miami taking on Florida. All right, previewing the contenders first. We have picked off Clemson, Florida State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and Miami in the ACC. We've moved on to the SEC with Texas A&M and LSU out of the Western Division. And, of course, we've got the Alabama Crimson Tide. 14-1 last year, 8-0. Sounds dominant, and it was until the SEC championship game in which Georgia outplayed Alabama. I heard a stat tonight on ESPN that out of the two championship games in which Georgia and Bama have played the past 2 years, one in the national championship game last year in the SEC in Atlanta, out of 289 plays, Georgia has either been tied or led for 280 of 289 plays, but Alabama won the game both times. Then it all came crashing down against Clemson after a fine first quarter, especially offensively, despite the pick six. Alabama was actually on pace to gain more than 1,000 yards after the first quarter. They were prolific, running the ball, mashing it downfield. The offensive line was busting holes in the Clemson defensive front. Tua had a clean pocket. He was firing downfield. The wide receivers who were getting separation, they were moving the ball at will. And then Clemson took over with the defensive front, taking over the game, and, of course, Trevor Lawrence and company. So for Alabama coming into this offseason, it's a bit of a question mark in regards to, are they still the kings of college football? They are not the national champions from 2018, but is this still the best program? They certainly looked like that team most of 2018, rolling through the competition in the SEC. No one challenged them until the game against Georgia. The last 4 years, Clemson and Alabama have dominated the sport. They're both 55-4, both 30-2 in conference play. So Bama 55-4, 30-2. We're looking at trajectories for each school that we're reviewing here. For Alabama, the recruiting rankings for 2020, looking ahead, right now they are knocking down the recruiting trail as they typically do. Number one in the SEC, number two in the country. The 19 class that will be on the field this fall, number one in the country. 2018, wow, they really slumped, brought in a horrible class. Number two in the SEC, number five in the country. 2017, number one. 2016, number one. So what is the trajectory of this program? It's in a sense the most difficult to weigh, but it's also the easiest one to weigh because basically Nick Saban took over in 2007 and the trajectory went straight up to the ceiling, and it's basically flatlined with a few little bumps. 2010, 2014, a few little dips slightly, but still people still considered, and rightfully so, this to be, even when they did not complete the season and win a national championship, to still be the best program. So it's basically hit the ceiling and just kept along the ceiling with everybody else below them. That's what it's been since 2009. The best decade of any program in major college football history over the past 10 years. I can't imagine that you're going to serve up since the 40s and 50s a program that's been this dominant for a full decade. But now with the Clemson loss, does that expose some weakness in the program? Has Clemson taken over? Are there some other programs out there like Georgia in the SEC that are just as good? With Kirby Smart basically matching Nick Saban on the recruiting trail. And then within the SEC Western Division is what Jimbo Fisher is doing at Texas A&M and LSU with Ed Orgeron ready to match Nick Saban. So those would be the questions in regards to competition, possibly catching up, or in Clemson's case, passing Bama. And so the trajectory is basically, and this little perceived dip because of the 44-16 result against Clemson is the Bama trajectory. It's based on Bama standards. Otherwise, it's still sky high. All right, the offense last year was prolific for the first time under Nick Saban. Of course, the Saban model has been workmanlike, game-managing type quarterbacks like Greg McElroy and Jay Coker and A.J. McCarron. And then Jalen Hurts was a bit of a different model, being dynamic on the ground, but being a less than marginal passer. He's improved, of course, and now he's at Oklahoma. Tua is a different cat. He's a different animal, and the offense has been truly dynamic. It's just a new Bama on offense. Number one passing efficiency offense, 46 points per game, 522 yards per game. Tua was posting numbers just playing first halves of games that were prolific. Now, over the past 4 to 5 games, knee injuries, ankle injuries, the better defenses that they played, putting some heat on him. Mississippi State, of course, Auburn to a certain extent, and then especially Georgia, then especially Clemson. So he started to look human. And he threw 6 interceptions in the final 4 to 5 games of the season after ripping off, I think, 29 touchdowns and no interceptions to start the season. So there are some questions as to whether he's fully healthy or can withstand a full season. There are some questions about him going for broke too much and being too susceptible to interceptions against good defenses and elite defenses. But he's still a great quarterback and still one of the 2 best in the nation. Mack Jones is a capable backup, and to his brother, Talia, will also be the backup, probably the third stringer. Mack Jones has been very impressive in spring games and otherwise, and certainly should be the backup. The Bama offense is 4 to 5 deep, elite at wide receiver. Of course, Jerry Jeudy was the Blitnikoff Award winner, 68 catches, 1,300 yards, 14 touchdowns. Jalen Waddle caught 45 and 7 touchdowns, almost 19 yards per catch. Henry Ruggs, brilliant, 46 catches, 11 touchdowns, and Devonta Smith, 42 and 6. And, of course, he caught the game winner at the national championship the season before, and he was banged up with injuries, and he should return to form as well. No Damian Harris, no Josh Jacobs, 2 NFL running backs now. Only at Bama do they lose 2 NFL quality running backs, and the running game in the backfield is just as good. Najee Harris gained 780-plus yards. Brian Robinson about 272. They're the studs, and there are reinforcements behind them as the 5 and 4 stars roll in. All right, the offensive line allowed the fewest sacks in the SEC. So this was Tua just zinging the ball downfield with a clean pocket, barely touched, barely a grass stain on his uniform until late in the season. That's when he got banged up. That's when he got hurt against better pass rushes. 2 starters gone along the offensive front. They have to replace the center, and that goes to Chris Owens, will be the new Bama center, but the offensive line appears to be just as good as it always has been at Alabama. The number 1 offensive line. I know Oklahoma's been really good the past 2 years, but during the Saban decade, there is no question that consistently the Alabama offensive line has been the best. All right, the defense. Lose a lot of players, as usual. They typically reload. And I've got full confidence that they will on just about every level, except for one special player, and that's Quinnen Williams. Who's going to replace that kind of massive productivity at the nose tackle position? He was just a monster of force like we've rarely seen, like Ndamukong Suh type massive disruption in the backfield. 19.5 tackles for loss out of a nose tackle and 8 sacks. And that doesn't really speak to it. If you just watch the games, he was constantly shoving offensive linemen into quarterbacks and ball carriers and just disrupting plays left and right and creating tackles for loss for other players. He's going to be impossible to replace with one guy. And the problem is, at one point, they can only replace any one player with one guy. So I understand they're going to get production out of a number of guys, but he's a once-in-a-decade kind of talent. Raekwon Davis, LeBron Ray, there are studs potentially at defensive end. The talent, the potential is there. They didn't post big numbers last year. They have to be more disruptive on the outside. At linebacker, you've got Dylan Moses. He's the best player. He's the leading tackler. He's the leader, period. Terrell Lewis is an interesting player on the outside and also could be a breakout. He was hobbled with a knee injury in 2018. He should be back to full strength, and he's got a chance to be a really special player. The secondary is loaded. So who's got the best secondary in the nation? I would say LSU starters are the best, but Alabama can just continue to bring them off the bench and line up nickelbacks outside of the two starting corners, a number of nickelbacks that are elite athletes. Safeties are great. In terms of depth, if you throw the depth factor into it, Alabama probably is the best secondary in college football. Patrick Surtain at corner, Trevor Diggs, they're the starting guys. Xavier McKinney had 74 tackles at safety. He's the leader there. And again, the secondary is just loaded. We could run through 8 or 10 players. They actually have 5 recruits coming into this 2019 season from the 19 class who were all top-rated guys, top 10 at their position. 5 guys just in the secondary. All right. Somebody asked me before I produced this video, Mark, do a video telling us how Alabama will not win the SEC Western Division. Tua gets hurt. I'm having a hard time. I went into this offseason thinking LSU and especially Texas A&M would have a shot to knock off Alabama. There are some issues working against those teams. They have much more difficult schedules. Alabama plays Tennessee, and they play South Carolina out of the SEC Eastern Division. LSU has to deal with Florida, so that's a potential loss. Texas A&M has to deal with South Carolina and Georgia. So it could be one of those deals that one of those two teams, especially Texas A&M with Bama at home, could knock off the Tide, but find 2 other losses somewhere else, and Bama still wins the SEC Western Division. They just have a light schedule. Duke non-conference, that's one of the 4 non-conference games, and that's the toughest. So Alabama did not schedule anyone tough in the non-conference, and I hear backlash when I present my criticism of the Alabama scheduling approach, which has been nothing but neutral site non-conference games since 2011. A lot of difficult games like Michigan, USC, Florida State, a lot of top opponents like that, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, some fairly formidable teams, Wisconsin, but always neutral sites. Now, they've scheduled them home and away in the future with Wisconsin in particular just recently, but this has been a joke. Louisville last year, Duke this year. That should not be Alabama's marquee game. It just shouldn't, but it is. And again, in the SEC, they get the light touch with Tennessee and South Carolina compared to what LSU and Texas A&M have to face. So how don't they win? Tua gets hurt. Other than that, LSU and Texas A&M are loaded with talent. They're loaded with top 5 to 10 talent. But both of those teams have just too many question marks compared, not to other teams, but compared to Alabama. Alabama basically has no question marks. The 2 issues last year is that Tua got banged up late in the season against an elite defensive front in Clemson. Yeah, he got knocked around a little bit because they had an all-time defensive front at Clemson. And the Bama secondary got torched at times by the likes of Georgia and Jake Fromm and, of course, Trevor Lawrence in the national championship game. So that could happen again, but everybody gets torched. In this day of air raid college football and with the precision of the passing and the elite receivers, nobody just shuts down a great offense. It just doesn't happen anymore. Alabama's defense played elite all season until the Georgia game and then certainly against Clemson. So there are slight question marks there. The defense, the secondary got torched. I have some questions about who's going to be the just mammoth rushers on the quarterback, whether that be on the edge or in the middle with Q gone, and nobody's really proven to be a consistent pass rusher. And again, the secondary got torched last year, but it's going to be much better with the players that they bring in. They just have so much depth in the secondary that if somebody's not playing up to an Alabama standard, replace him. They are like 8 to 10 deep at DB to where they can play the 5 to 7 best guys and leave 4 and 5 stars on the bench. If they're not performing, if they missed assignments, missed tackles, leave them on the bench. So this team really has no glaring weaknesses like LSU has inconsistency at wide receiver, has young running backs that are unproven, has a quarterback that's a bit limited. Texas A&M, the linebacking play has been substandard. They have questions along the defensive front. The offensive line was marginal last year. They've got to replace Travion Williams. So those two other teams have too many question marks in comparison to Alabama. My official prediction is coming. We're going to blow it out big the last week of the offseason in terms of predictions right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Remember, for those of you who love to throw a few bucks on the games, grab the link in the description section below next to the hashtag #SamStrong. It's definitely for a worthy cause. I've explained in other videos. It's for a worthy cause and an initiative between St. Jude's Hospital, Volunteer Roadshow, and some of us YouTubers in trying to build a fund for cancer research and to help, again, Sam Bobby from Volunteer Roadshow's son who struggles and is fighting cancer. Hashtag #SamStrong. Remember that one. Grab the link in the description section below. When you fund your account, you will get 50% additional added to it because you signed up using the promo code MRTVCFB, Mark Rogers TV College Football, MRTVCFB. And we'll be back with another preview from the SEC right here on Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.